He was beaten, bleeding, and left to die in the snow-covered woods. But even in pain, he didn't give up, because somewhere deep in his heart, he still believed in the kindness of humans. That belief led him to a lonely cabin, and to a man who had given up on life. What happened next would melt even the coldest heart. And in the end, this dog would give everything to save the one who once saved him. The snow was falling again, quiet, steady, and thick. It buried the trees and smothered all sound, as if the forest had decided to forget the world outside. But deep within that stillness, pain moved. A lone German shepherd staggered forward. He had no collar now, no name. But not long ago, he was called Rex. Rex was 3 years old, tall for his breed, with a sleek black and tan coat now darkened by dirt, blood, and frost. His body was built like a soldier's. Strong legs, squared shoulders, keen eyes, but tonight he moved like a ghost, limping, shaking, silent. His right side was badly bruised, likely from being kicked. A patch of fur on his left flank was missing, revealing torn, angry skin. The cold had crept into every wound, but he kept walking, because walking was all he could do. Rex had been born in a small kennel outside Bozeman. The breeder, a quiet woman with gentle hands, had taken good care of the puppies, feeding them with care, letting them sleep curled up beside her stove. Rex had been one of the stronger ones, clever and quick to learn. At 8 weeks, he'd been chosen by a man named Carl. Carl was in his early 40s, with a beard like old wire and eyes that never smiled. Stocky and impatient, he had no time for mistakes, whether from people or animals. A hunter by trade and temperament, Carl saw dogs not as companions, but as tools, and when tools broke, they were discarded. At first, Rex had tried to please him. He'd learned commands quickly, responded to whistles, tracked wounded birds through brush and snow, but Carl never gave praise. Only silence when Rex did right, and pain when he didn't. One day, Rex chased a deer instead of staying on trail. Carl beat him. Another day, Rex barked at a snake near the cabin. Carl kicked him across the porch. There was never a moment of kindness, only anger and hunger and long days tied alone behind the shed. Then came the final hunt. It was early morning, the wind cruel, the sky spitting snow. Carl had taken Rex out into the woods to flush game, but they returned empty-handed. Carl's silence that day was different. Cold, final. That night, Carl dragged Rex to the truck bed without a word. He drove into the woods, deeper than they'd ever gone. Then he stopped, got out, and pulled Rex down by the collar. The first hit came with the butt of the rifle, then a boot to the ribs, then another. Rex didn't fight back. He never did. He just whimpered once, then went still. Carl left him there, bleeding and breathless in the snow, then drove away. The sound of the engine faded. The forest closed in. But Rex did not die, not then. It took hours before he could move again. His legs trembled as he pushed himself up, blood staining the snow beneath him. Every step was fire, but something, some whisper of instinct or memory or faith, drove him forward. The forest was endless, the cold unforgiving. He passed frozen streams and trees heavy with snow. His breath came in short, shallow gasps. Hunger clawed at him, but there was no food, no shelter, no voice calling his name. Still, he walked. Once, he saw a shadow, another animal, maybe a coyote, but it vanished between trees before he could react. Another time, he came across a patch of old firewood, half buried in snow. He sniffed it. Nothing human remained. No warmth, no scent of safety. His paws began to crack and bleed, and yet he walked. Because Rex still believed, somewhere deep inside, that there was something better. A home, a hand that wouldn't strike, a voice that didn't shout. Perhaps he remembered the gentle hands of the breeder. Perhaps it was just a dog's stubborn loyalty to the idea of love. But he didn't stop. The snow thickened, the world blurred. At one point, he slipped down a small slope and landed hard. He lay there for a long time, his ribs heaving, eyes glazed. He might have given up then. But a sound, the soft crunch of wind through branches, pulled him back. And so, he rose again, limping, breathing, believing. Somewhere in the forest ahead there was light. Not from the sky, but faint, flickering, from behind the trees. He didn't understand it, but it called to him. With the last of his strength, he followed it. The storm had come in fast that night, sweeping over the pines of northern Montana with a fury that blanketed the world in white. Wind shrieked through the branches, slamming against the worn walls of a lonely wooden cabin tucked deep into the forest. Snow gathered like secrets at the corners of the porch, and all around was silence, save for the occasional groan of old timber under pressure. Inside the cabin, Frank Ellis sat alone in a threadbare recliner, the only sound the crackling fire and the ticking of a dusty old clock above the hearth. The room smelled faintly of cedar smoke and old coffee. His hands, thick with veins and calluses, rested on the arms of the chair, fingers twitching occasionally from an old war injury that never quite healed right. Frank was 72, tall but slightly stooped, with a wiry frame that still held the echo of military posture. His face was a map of time, deep wrinkles cutting across sun-darkened skin, a strong nose broken once in youth, and steel-blue eyes that had seen too much. His hair, once black as coal, had faded to white and was trimmed short like it always had been since his days in uniform. He didn't smile much. Hadn't in years. He'd come to this place, miles from the nearest road, deeper still from the nearest person, because the world had stopped making sense after his son David was killed in action. His wife Martha had followed not long after, cancer moving through her like a quiet fire. Since then, silence had become his only company. Silence and routine. Each day passed like the last. Split wood, boiled coffee, checked traps, radioed weather. He didn't mind the cold. He minded nothing, really. It was easier that way. But tonight, something shifted. At first, he thought it was the wind again, a strange rhythm beneath the gusts, soft, strained. Then came a faint thump. Not quite a knock, but not just snow either. He frowned, stood, and grabbed the flashlight that always hung on the wall by the door. He opened it slowly, cautiously, the wind slapping against him like a warning. There, slumped at the edge of his porch steps, was a dog. It lay curled on its side, motionless except for the rise and fall of shallow breaths. Its coat was a patchwork of snow, mud, and dried blood. The left hind leg looked stiff, the ribs beneath its fur too visible for comfort. But it wasn't the injuries that made Frank pause. It was the eyes. The German shepherd raised its head just enough to meet his gaze. Amber eyes, sharp with pain, but somehow unbroken. There was no fear in them, no blame, just quiet endurance. Frank's gut twisted. He hadn't seen that look in years, not since the war. That same stubborn glint in a young private's eyes, refusing to be carried off the field, despite a broken arm and a bullet in his leg. The dog didn't move, just kept watching. Frank muttered under his breath, "Don't you look at me like that." He shut the door. Inside, he paced once, twice, looked at the fire, then back at the door. It wasn't his problem. He didn't need a dog, especially not a half-dead one. But still, those eyes. He opened the door again. The dog hadn't moved. Snow now dusted its snout. The wind howled past like it had somewhere better to be. Frank exhaled a curse under his breath and stepped out. His boots crunched against the icy wood. He knelt beside the animal, inspecting the wounds with the efficiency of someone who'd patched up men in field tents half a world away. Bruises, shallow cuts, cold but not frostbitten yet. Malnourished for sure. "You're a damn mess," he muttered, "and I must be a fool." He slipped his arms gently beneath the dog's body. It was heavier than expected, but limp, trusting. He carried it inside and placed it on an old wool blanket near the fire. Once the door was shut, the storm outside raged louder, like it was angry at his defiance. Frank stood over the dog for a moment, then returned to the kitchen to fill a bowl with warm water and another with some leftover stew he'd been planning to throw out. The dog lapped at the water slowly. His jaw was swollen, but not broken. Frank didn't speak much. He wasn't used to it. But he did murmur a few things while tending to the creature, mostly out of habit. "You don't stink too bad for a stray," he said once. "Not yet, anyway." As he cleaned the wounds with gentle hands, he noticed scars under the fur. Old ones. Lines that suggested this wasn't the first time the dog had been hurt. A life of pain, but still alive. Still trusting. "Stupid kind of loyalty," Frank muttered. The dog flinched slightly as Frank pressed a damp cloth against a gash, but didn't growl. Didn't bite. Just closed his eyes for a moment. Frank didn't know what made him do it, but he reached out and gently scratched behind the dog's ear, the uninjured one. The dog's eyes opened, soft now, and something passed between them. Not thanks, not affection, but understanding. An unspoken truth that neither of them had said aloud. We're both still here, somehow. Frank sat back in his chair. The fire danced. The wind screamed against the walls. And in the flickering light, for the first time in many winters, the cabin no longer felt entirely empty. He didn't name the dog. Not that night. He told himself it was just for a few days, just until the weather cleared and the dog could stand on its own again. But deep down, in the quiet places of his heart he never visited, something had shifted. The soldier who had shut the world out for so long had let something in. He didn't know why. Maybe it was those eyes. Morning came quietly, the kind of winter morning that held its breath. Outside, the forest was a cathedral of white, snow resting on every limb, muffling every sound. Inside the small cabin, warmth radiated gently from the old stone hearth. The fire had burned through the night, and the embers still glowed softly, casting an amber hue across the wooden floor where a dog lay resting. Scout, as Frank had begun to call him, stirred beneath the wool blanket, shifting slightly, one ear twitching at the sound of the kettle hissing on the stove. His breathing had steadied, slow and deep, and his wounds, though still raw, were clean. His fur, once matted with blood and crusted snow, was now brushed free of ice. The bruises along his ribs remained dark, but less swollen. He still limped, but the tremble in his steps had started to fade. Frank stood at the counter, pouring 2 mugs, one with black coffee for himself, one with warm broth for the dog. He didn't speak, but his motions were careful, deliberate, the way a man moves when he doesn't quite admit he cares, but still does. He placed the bowl near the fire, stepping back without a word. Scout raised his head, looked at him, and then, with slow effort, moved toward the bowl. Frank watched in silence as the dog lapped the broth slowly, pausing now and then as if savoring the warmth more than the flavor. When he finished, he licked his lips once and looked back at Frank with eyes that said more than gratitude. They spoke of trust, tentative but growing. Frank returned to his chair by the fire. The recliner creaked as he settled in, one leg crossed over the other, the coffee warm between his hands. For a while, neither of them moved. The quiet between them wasn't awkward. It was familiar, like 2 soldiers on patrol, understanding each other without the need for words. He hadn't intended to name the dog, but the way the animal observed him, silent, always alert, reminded Frank of the young scouts he'd commanded in the war. Men who said little but saw everything. Men who rarely needed orders. And so, the name came to him naturally. Scout, he'd murmured that morning, almost testing the sound. The dog hadn't reacted at first, but later, when Frank said it again, softer, slower, he thought he saw the dog's ears shift slightly, as though acknowledging something that had been lost and was now found again. In the days that followed, a routine emerged. Frank woke early, just as he had done every day since the war. He'd stoke the fire, make his coffee, and check on Scout, whose eyes now opened when he approached, tail brushing once or twice against the floor in slow, cautious sways. At midday, they'd venture just outside, Scout walking close behind, sometimes resting when the snow grew deep or the cold too sharp. Frank never rushed him. Healing, he knew, took its own time. Back inside, he began speaking again. Not in full conversations, but in small pieces, scattered like footprints in fresh snow. He talked about the weather, about the traps he used to set, but didn't anymore, about the way the forest had changed in the last 10 years. He told Scout about Martha and the garden she'd loved, about the way her laughter once filled this very room. He spoke David's name out loud for the first time in months. Scout listened, not with understanding perhaps, but with presence, and that was enough. Frank caught himself staring at the dog sometimes, at the way he held his head high despite the pain, the way he moved without complaint. There was a quiet resilience in Scout, something deep and unshaken, as if being betrayed by humans hadn't destroyed his belief in them. Frank found that notion unbearable and beautiful all at once. He hadn't realized how quiet the cabin had become until Scout arrived, not the silence of sound, but the kind that lived inside his chest, heavy and stale. With Scout lying near the fire, tail twitching in his sleep, breathing in rhythm with the room, that silence began to lift. Just a little. One afternoon, Frank brought out an old photograph. It was tucked in a drawer he hadn't opened in years. The picture was of Martha and David, standing in front of the cabin, both laughing. David in uniform, Martha in a sun hat too large for her head. He sat down across from Scout, held the frame in his hands for a long while, then lowered it slowly until the dog's eyes met the image. "My whole world," he said quietly. Scout didn't move, but his gaze lingered on Frank, as if sensing the weight of the moment. That evening, Frank lit a second lantern. The cabin glowed just a bit warmer. He even turned the radio on for the first time in years, letting a soft old country tune drift through the air like memory. Scout didn't flinch at the music. He simply curled deeper into his blanket, one paw draped over the other, eyes half closed, but listening. The days bled gently into one another. Snow still fell outside, though it softened. Frank began taking longer walks around the cabin, Scout beside him, slow but steady. Once, Frank paused at the tree line and pointed. "There's an old deer path that way," he said. "Used to follow it when I needed to clear my head." Scout stood beside him, nose twitching in the wind, tail still. They turned back together, footprints side by side in the snow. That night, Frank lay in bed, Scout curled on the rug by the door. As he closed his eyes, Frank whispered a name he hadn't spoken aloud in a very long time. "Thank you, boy." And though the wind howled again outside, inside the cabin there was only stillness and the warm, quiet pulse of something returning. Not just health, not just strength, but life. The air was sharp and brittle that morning, the kind of cold that crept into bones and made trees groan beneath its weight. The snow, weeks old now, had hardened into a thick crust over the forest floor, broken only by the trail Frank and Scout carved with slow, deliberate steps. Frank held a walking stick in one gloved hand, and occasionally stopped to inspect small details. Bent branches, faint tracks, the whisper of movement just beyond the pines. Scout, always just a few feet ahead or behind, moved in silence, alert, his gait steady despite the lingering weakness in his right hind leg. They had gone farther than usual today, the cabin now a distant memory behind a ridge of evergreens. Frank hadn't planned to be out this long, but something about the forest's stillness felt off. He wanted to make sure nothing had changed since the last storm. No fallen trees blocking the creek, no signs of predators drifting too close. It wasn't a matter of fear, it was instinct. A soldier's habit that refused to fade, even after all these years. The clearing they entered was narrow and unusually open, surrounded by thin birches with their papery white bark peeling back like old letters. Scout stopped suddenly, nose low to the snow, his tail stiff and straight. Frank paused too, frowning. Then he saw it. A glint of metal half buried under the snow. He stepped closer, crouched slowly, and brushed away the icy layer. What he uncovered was a trap, new, well-oiled, the steel teeth clean and sharp. It wasn't one of his. He hadn't laid traps in years. As he straightened, his eyes moved across the clearing, and he began to see more of them. 3, 4. A web of illegal snares, each hidden just enough to trick any wandering animal. His jaw clenched. Whoever had done this wasn't just careless. They were cruel. A crack in the snow behind him made him turn. He wasn't alone. The blow came fast, a sharp strike to the back of the head. Not enough to kill, but more than enough to drop him to one knee. He caught a glimpse of boots, of a coat dusted with frost. Someone grabbed him by the collar and threw him hard onto the frozen ground. The impact knocked the wind from his lungs, and before he could fully gather himself, another kick landed in his ribs. Scout barked sharply behind him, but then yelped, high and desperate, cut off by a loud, angry voice. "Quiet, mutt!" Frank tried to rise, but the world tilted sideways. He caught the sound of at least 2 voices, footsteps crunching snow, someone spitting to the side. Old fool probably saw the traps. "He's not going to do anything. Leave him. The cold will handle the rest." Another blow, and then silence. They were gone. He didn't know how long he lay there. The snow pressed against his back, soaking through his coat. His breath steamed in shallow bursts, and pain spread through his chest like a slow burn. His legs wouldn't move. His hands barely obeyed. Somewhere behind his eyes, darkness lurked, curling inward. And then a warm muzzle pressed against his cheek. Scout. The dog whimpered and nudged him again, pawing softly at his shoulder. Frank stirred, but only barely. His voice, when it came, was a whisper lost in the wind. Go home." But Scout didn't move away. He stayed beside the fallen man, circling once, then twice, nudging and pawing, trying desperately to get Frank to his feet. He pulled lightly at the sleeve of Frank's coat, but the man was too heavy, too still. The dog paused, chest heaving, eyes flicking toward the woods beyond the clearing. Then, slowly, Scout began to move. He stepped back, his head low, tail stiff, and began to mark the snow with his paws, scratching into the ice, leaving trails of red from the cracked pads on his feet. Each few feet he stopped to rub against a tree, pressing his side, one that still bore the memory of old wounds, against the bark until a small smear of blood remained. A trail, a path, a desperate message in the frozen woods. Then, without hesitation, he turned and ran. The snow was deep, and his breath came ragged and fast. His paws tore through the crust, breaking open the cuts that had barely begun to heal. He moved like a shadow, weaving between trees, ears laid flat against his head, ignoring the sting of every branch that slapped his face. The cold bit deeper now, but Scout didn't slow. Somewhere in the forest, he remembered a smell. Smoke, meat, people. Days ago, maybe more, he had caught the scent while walking with Frank near the western ridge, a campground. Humans. He ran in that direction now, trusting his nose, his memory, and the sheer force of will that drove him forward. His side burned with every breath. A sharp cut along his shoulder, where he'd scraped against one of the hidden traps, had reopened, staining his fur a deep red. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. At last, through the haze of trees, he saw it. A flicker, firelight, and the shape of a tent. Scout stumbled to a halt near the edge of the small campground. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he couldn't find the strength to bark. He opened his mouth, managed a low, hoarse howl, then another, louder. Each sound wavered through the trees, desperate and wild. Then came voices, movement. A figure stepped out of the tent, bundled in a thick orange parka, flashlight swinging in one gloved hand. A boy's voice, startled, unsure. "Dad, there's a dog!" Scout barked again, one final cry, before his legs buckled beneath him, and he collapsed into the snow. The snow crackled beneath Ethan's boots as he stepped cautiously toward the edge of the forest clearing, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The wind had begun to pick up again, pulling at the edges of his hood and stinging his cheeks. At 16, Ethan Mitchell was tall for his age, with a mop of copper-brown hair that never stayed flat, and freckles that dotted the bridge of his nose. His green eyes, usually curious and light-hearted, now carried a glint of concern as he scanned the woods. He was no stranger to the outdoors. His father had taken him camping every winter since he was 8. But something about the cry they'd just heard had unsettled him. Behind him, his father, Greg Mitchell, moved slower, more cautious. Greg was a broad-shouldered man in his early 40s, with a short beard and a quiet presence. A history teacher back home, Greg had a deep respect for nature and a calm, methodical way of doing everything. Building fires, pitching tents, and now, approaching the sound of an injured animal. His breath came in clouds as he tightened his gloves and stepped beside his son. "There," Ethan whispered, pointing toward the snow. A shape lay slumped just beyond the firelight, half buried in powdery drifts. As they drew closer, the beam of Ethan's flashlight revealed it. A German shepherd, motionless, its chest rising in shallow bursts, one leg stretched unnaturally. Its fur was torn in places, dark with blood, and around its neck, ice clung to clumps of matted hair. But it wasn't just the injuries that held Ethan in place. It was the dog's eyes. They were wide, still alert, filled with something far beyond fear, a desperate plea, a direction. The dog tried to rise when it saw them, but crumpled again with a faint, broken whine. Then, despite everything, it began to crawl forward. Whoa, easy," Greg murmured, crouching low. The dog let out a hoarse bark, not toward them, but toward the trees behind him. He struggled once more, pulling himself a few feet, then looked back at them with a gaze so urgent, so filled with purpose, that Greg and Ethan understood almost instantly. "He's leading us," Ethan said, already stepping into the deeper snow. Greg hesitated for only a moment before grabbing a thermal blanket from their gear pile. "Bring the med kit, we'll need it." Scout led them slowly, limping and panting. stopping every few feet to glance back, his tail barely swaying. The trail wasn't far, just a few hundred yards, but in the thick of night and snow, it felt like miles. Ethan slipped twice, but pressed forward, flashlight dancing across trees and shadows. Then, through the pines, they saw him. Frank lay twisted in the snow, one arm awkwardly beneath him, his coat partially covered in ice. His face was pale, lips blue, and for a terrible moment, Greg feared they had come too late. But as he knelt beside the man and pressed 2 fingers to the side of his neck, he felt it. A pulse, faint, fragile, but still there. "We need help, fast," Greg said sharply, already pulling off his gloves to check for signs of frostbite. "Ethan, your phone. Call 911. Give them our coordinates." Ethan was already fumbling through his coat pocket, breath shallow as he spoke into the receiver. He didn't look at Scout, not yet. He couldn't. Not until this part was done. The emergency operator promised a rescue team was on the way. They would come by snowmobile. Estimated arrival, 20 minutes. Greg covered Frank with the emergency blanket, gently elevating his head and brushing snow from his face. He whispered reassurances, unsure if the man could hear him. Beside him, Scout collapsed fully into the snow, his body trembling, every breath a visible shiver. "He didn't leave him," Ethan said softly, kneeling beside the dog. "All that way, in this weather, he didn't stop." Greg glanced at the shepherd, saw the blood caked beneath his fur, the raw pads of his paws, the slashes along his legs that had long since frozen. Scout was more than injured. He was spent, running on faith alone. "I don't think he had anything left," Greg said, voice tight. They tried to keep Scout warm, covering him gently, coaxing a few sips of water between his cracked lips. But the dog didn't drink. His eyes stayed fixed on Frank's face, as if refusing to look away, even as his own eyelids drooped with exhaustion. The rescue team arrived just after midnight. 3 medics in heavy parkas, hauling sleds and medical gear. Frank was quickly assessed, loaded onto a stretcher, and wrapped in heated blankets. One of the medics, a tall woman named Carla with short gray hair and efficient hands, checked Scout next. "This one's in bad shape," she said, gently lifting his paw. "You found them both like this?" Greg nodded. "The dog led us here." Carla looked down at Scout with something like reverence. He saved that man's life. Ethan, standing nearby, clenched his jaw. "Will he make it?" Carla didn't answer immediately. She finished wrapping Scout in thermal cloth, then laid a gentle hand on his head. "We'll try." They secured both bodies to sleds, Frank unconscious but stable, Scout unmoving except for the rise and fall of his chest. The journey back to the trailhead was long, slow, and quiet. Ethan rode beside Scout, one gloved hand resting lightly on the dog's side, whispering encouragements he wasn't sure the shepherd could hear. Under the stars, the woods faded behind them. But as the snowmobile cut through the last stretch of trees, Scout gave one last breath, a long, soft exhale, and then stilled. Ethan felt it beneath his hand. "No," he whispered, voice cracking. Greg, watching from the second sled, closed his eyes. Carla checked quickly, then placed a hand gently over the dog's heart. "He's gone." They rode the rest of the way in silence. At the base camp, Frank was transferred to a waiting ambulance, still unconscious. Scout's body, wrapped carefully in blankets, was carried in the second truck. No one spoke much, but in the eyes of every rescuer, there was something unspoken, an awe reserved not for soldiers or heroes, but something quieter, purer, the kind of loyalty that doesn't ask questions, the kind of love that runs until it has nothing left to give, the kind of sacrifice only a dog can make. The hospital room was quiet, dimly lit by the soft afternoon sun that spilled through half-closed blinds. Machines beeped gently, their rhythm steady, marking the slow return of breath and consciousness. Frank Ellis lay propped in the bed, bandages wrapped around his ribs, a bruise blooming across his jaw. The nurses had said he was lucky. Hypothermia, concussion, 2 cracked ribs, but nothing permanent. Nothing at least that hadn't already been broken long before the snow. He hadn't said much since waking. He'd thanked the doctors, nodded politely to the staff, but mostly he stared out the window, toward the trees, toward something he couldn't see anymore. The blanket across his lap did little to warm him. The only warmth he remembered now had lain beside him in the snow, bleeding and silent. gone before the morning. Scout. Frank's fingers curled slightly over the edge of the blanket. They hadn't let him see the body. Not yet. Maybe never. He'd been told the dog died peacefully, that he'd done something incredible. But Frank already knew that. He'd known it before the medics arrived, known it in the look Scout had given him, calm, unafraid, and deeply certain that Frank would live. And now he was left behind, again. The knock at the door was gentle. "Mr. Ellis?" came a voice, young, polite, unsure. Frank turned. In the doorway stood a teenager, slender build, shaggy copper hair, and a soft face still caught between boyhood and something older. He wore a thick flannel coat, jeans still dusted with dried snow, and a faded gray beanie. His green eyes, bright, open, searched Frank's with quiet hesitation. "I'm Ethan," he said. I'm the one who found you." Frank studied him for a long second, then nodded once. "Come in." Ethan stepped inside and held something out. A folded piece of notebook paper, the lines smudged where ink had blurred. "I wrote this, for my school blog at first. I didn't expect anyone to read it, really." Frank took the page with calloused hands, unfolding it carefully. The handwriting was neat, thoughtful. At the top, a title in capital letters, "The Dog Who Believed in Us." He read in silence. It was short, but it didn't need to be long. Ethan's words painted Scout not as a victim, but a hero. Not just a dog who suffered, but a soul who saved. He wrote about the howl in the woods, the trail of blood, the refusal to leave his injured friend. He wrote about the way Scout had looked at them, not with fear, but urgency, purpose, the kind of loyalty most people couldn't understand. He ended with a line Frank would never forget. "He believed in us, even when we didn't deserve it, and that's what makes his story worth telling." Frank cleared his throat, folding the paper slowly. "You've got a good way with words." Ethan smiled, sheepish. "My mom's a journalist. I guess I get it from her." Frank nodded. "She teach you to write like that?" Ethan's smile faltered for a moment. "She passed away last year, cancer. Dad and I started camping again after that. Said the woods help us breathe better." Frank's gaze softened. "They do." Ethan hesitated. "I hope it's okay, but I posted the story online. I just wanted people to know about him, about Scout." Frank blinked. "Scout? That's what I called him," Ethan said quickly. "I didn't know you'd already named him that too. I didn't mean—" Frank shook his head. "It fits." A silence passed between them, not awkward, but respectful. Then Ethan reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone. It kind of went viral. He handed the phone to Frank, who squinted at the screen. The article had been shared over 100,000 times. Comments flowed endlessly below. Messages from strangers, from soldiers, from dog lovers and animal rescue groups. Some left prayers, others stories. A few offered to donate money in Scout's name. Frank read in silence, something tightening behind his ribs that had nothing to do with cracked bones. A nurse came in briefly to check his vitals, a kind woman named Teresa in her 50s, with a warm smile and tired eyes that had seen too many endings. She greeted Ethan with a friendly nod. He'd been back twice already, and gently adjusted Frank's IV before leaving them alone again. Later that day, another nurse handed Frank a stack of envelopes. "These came for you, Mr. Ellis. People are sending letters, dozens of them." He didn't open them at first. He let the weight of them sit on the tray beside his bed. But later, as evening crept through the windows, he picked one up, tore it open with rough fingers. The first was from a veteran in Arizona. "I never trusted another soul after the war, until I adopted my dog. Your story reminded me that healing doesn't come the way we expect it." The next was from a little girl in Oregon who wrote in purple crayon, "Scout is my hero. I hope he has wings now." Another came from a woman in her 70s who'd lost her husband the year before. "That dog reminded me that love doesn't end when the body gives out. It carries us further than we think we can go." Frank read each one slowly, carefully. Then he found it. The envelope was plain, the handwriting stiff. There was no return address. Inside, a single page, no greeting, just a few shaky lines. "I was his first owner. I trained him wrong, hurt him when he didn't deserve it. I was angry at the world and took it out on the only living thing that ever trusted me. I don't expect forgiveness, but I saw what he did. I saw the story, and I cried. I hope wherever he is, he knows I'm sorry." Frank stared at the words. Then he folded the letter carefully and set it aside. Outside, dusk had settled. Lights flickered on across the parking lot. In the corner of the room, Scout's old blanket, retrieved from the sled, sat folded in a chair. The staff had washed it, but a faint scent still clung to the fabric. Frank reached for it slowly and held it in his lap, his hand resting over the soft wool. Forgiveness. It wasn't a word he had known well. He hadn't forgiven the war, or the government that sent his son to die. He hadn't forgiven the world for taking Martha too soon. And until now, he hadn't forgiven himself for surviving. But Scout had. That dog had known nothing but pain from humans. And yet he believed. He chose to stay, to run, to fight for someone else's life. Frank closed his eyes. Maybe it was time he tried to do the same. The snow returned a year later, as gentle as breath and just as quiet. It came in the night, soft flakes falling against the windows of a newly built lodge nestled at the edge of the forest. The wood of the walls still smelled fresh, and the glass reflected golden light from inside, where warmth pulsed through open rooms and hushed voices moved with calm purpose. A sign out front read, "Scout's Hope, Animal Rescue and Healing Center." It had been Frank's idea, though he never called it that. The money had come from his savings, decades of pension, untouched since Martha passed, and from donations that arrived by the dozens after Scout's story had swept through the country. Letters had come too, many of them with checks enclosed, all carrying some version of the same message. Because of him, I remembered how to hope. Frank Ellis now walked slower than he once did, but his shoulders stood a little straighter, and there was something brighter behind his tired eyes. He no longer lived alone. The lodge had a small apartment upstairs for him and 2 staff rooms for volunteers. But most days, he was downstairs with the animals, feeding, brushing, mending. He'd kept the walls of the front room bare except for one thing, a framed photo of Scout above the fireplace. The photo had been taken by Ethan on the day they opened, printed in black and white, and it showed Scout standing just outside Frank's cabin door, head turned slightly toward the woods, eyes alert and full of that same steady trust that had once changed everything. Ethan had taken to visiting every weekend since that night in the woods. He was taller now, his voice deeper, and he wore the same beat-up flannel coat from last year, even though it barely fit. He split his time between school and volunteering, feeding dogs, cleaning stalls, taking photos for their social media page. His gentle way with the animals surprised everyone, especially the more anxious dogs, who seemed to settle when he sat near them. He called them all Buddy, and they responded to his voice like a soft kind of gravity. Greg Mitchell, Ethan's father, had joined the project too. At first, it was just to help with carpentry. He was good with his hands, patient and careful, but over time, he stayed to manage the logistics. Greg was broad, quiet, with a calming presence that balanced Frank's quieter intensity. He'd begun holding monthly workshops for new pet adopters, gentle training methods, how to build trust with trauma-affected animals, even basic first aid. Then there was Lena, the newest addition to the team. Lena Torres was in her early 30s, with shoulder-length black curls, tan skin, and eyes the color of dark honey. She'd come from Albuquerque, where she had run a small rescue until wildfire season destroyed her facility. Thin but strong, with a voice that carried warmth and quiet authority, Lena had a way of getting animals to trust her in minutes. She'd lost 2 dogs in the fire and hadn't spoken about it until weeks after arriving, but when she did, she said it to Frank over coffee, her voice even, but her hands shaking slightly. "I just couldn't let the next ones die waiting for help." Frank nodded and said nothing, but the next morning, he cleared out the old greenhouse and gave it to her to convert into an infirmary space. She filled it with blankets, crates, shelves of medicine, and soft music that played from a hidden speaker. The lodge slowly became more than a rescue center. It became a refuge, for animals, yes, but also for people. There was the elderly man from Butte who brought in a 3-legged terrier he found by the river. He came back every Sunday just to walk her around the grounds. There was the teenage girl named Mia who volunteered after school, quiet and withdrawn, until one of the rescued cats curled into her lap and she began to speak again, for the first time in months. There were the veterans, Frank's old unit buddies who visited with their dogs and sometimes their ghosts, and who found in the quiet spaces of Scout's hope a kind of peace they hadn't known in years. And there was Frank. Every morning he rose before the sun, boiled water the way Martha used to, and took his coffee into the front room. He lit the fire beneath Scout's photo and sat beside it, listening to the slow crackle of warmth rising from the hearth. On the first snowfall of the season, he did something else. He reached into the small wooden box on the mantel and pulled out the only photo he had of Scout, taken just days before that final journey. The dog stood in the snow, gaze turned slightly to the side, as if listening to something distant. Frank placed the photo gently on the coffee table, beside a worn patch of Scout's blanket that had been stitched and framed in glass. Then he whispered the same words he had the year before. "Thank you, buddy. You brought me back." Outside, the snow deepened. Dogs barked in the play yard, their joyful howls echoing through the trees. Volunteers moved across the property with leashes and gloves, their laughter rising and fading like music. The wind carried the scent of pine and wood smoke, and the sound of paws crunching snow mixed with the beating of hearts that had been broken once and learned to love again. Scout was gone, but his legacy lived in every rescued tail that wagged, in every hand that reached with gentleness, in every stranger who arrived feeling lost and left with something held, something healed. Scout had once believed in the goodness of people, against every reason not to. Now, because of him, so many believed again, and each time the snow began to fall, Frank lit the fire, sat beside it, and remembered not the loss, but the gift. A gift with 4 legs, a broken past, and a heart that refused to give up. Sometimes, the greatest miracles don't come with thunder or light. They come on 4 legs, with tired eyes, and a heart that refuses to give up. Scout reminded us that even after betrayal, there can still be trust. That even when the world turns cold, love can still find its way through. And maybe, just maybe, God doesn't always send angels with wings. Sometimes, He sends them in fur, with a purpose only heaven could understand. So if you're listening right now, and you've ever felt forgotten or broken, let this be your gentle reminder. You are not alone. God sees you, and His grace is never far away. May the Lord bless you. May He bring peace to your heart. And may you always have a light, even in the darkest woods. If this story touched you, please share it with someone who needs a little hope today. Leave us a comment, tell us your story. And if you believe in the power of love, in the kindness of animals, and in the quiet miracles God still sends our way, don't forget to subscribe. From our family to yours, thank you for listening, and may God walk beside you, always,